Hey, this is Aaron Rubinowitz for CreativeCow.net. Today I'd like to talk about the Psycore effect called CC Force Motion Blur. This effect can apply a motion blur to effects with no native blur for added realism. For example, in this animation, I'm using the effect called CC Page Turn. Just so you know, the paper texture was generated with some fractal noise settings I got from Chris Suar's Creative Cow tutorial called, not surprisingly, Creating an Old Paper Texture. Looks pretty good, so check it out. Anyway, as you can see, CC Page Turn is a really cool effect, but it never looks all that real because it has no motion blur. But Force Motion Blur can really improve the look provided you know how to use it. Unfortunately, what happens is that most After Effects users add the effect and then find that their other effects have been negated. That is, that they disappear. And once that happens, the effect gets relegated to the area of their brain called Do Not Use. Alas, another plugin sent to the effects graveyard. But you know, a plugin is a terrible thing to waste. And like many effects in After Effects, to work with other effects, Force Motion Blur either needs to be applied to a nested composition or to an adjustment layer which creates an overall effect on everything below it. In the case of this page turning animation, I would use an adjustment layer which I would add by choosing Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Then, making sure my adjustment layer is selected, I would choose Effect, Time, CC Force Motion Blur. As you can see, we already have some real improvement to the look here, but I would also make sure to set this effect's motion blur levels to 16 instead of the default 8, because the native After Effects blur uses 16 samples. Having more blur samples does improve the look, but at the cost of a render hit. In fact, in general, this effect adds some serious overhead to After Effects, so keep that in mind. Force Motion Blur works with many of the Psycore effects such as CC Starburst or CC Mercury, but it's not just for use with the Psycore effects. Many of After Effects' standard effects can really be improved with the use of the Force Motion Blur effect. In this case, I have the shadow effect going, which doesn't have a native blur. Now, as I mentioned, you can't add the Force Motion Blur directly to a layer with an effect or you'll lose that effect. And I could use an adjustment layer, but because I have other layers being animated for which I don't need the Force Motion Blur effect, and I want to add as little to the render hit as possible, I'm going to pre-compose the shadow layer by selecting it and then choosing Layer, Pre-compose. And I'll use the Move All Attributes setting, and then I'll click OK. If you aren't familiar with pre-composing, I've covered the subjects of nesting and pre-composing in many of my previous tutorials, such as my lip sync tutorial, so I'm going to skip it here. With the shadow layer selected, I'll choose Effect, Time, CC Force Motion Blur. As you can see, the look is greatly enhanced. So you're probably wondering why this effect is found under the Effects, Time category and not under the Effects, Blur category. Well, that's an excellent question. Turns out this effect has a very powerful use that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. When you time remap or time stretch footage to move faster than the speed at which it was originally captured or rendered, it becomes obvious very quickly that something isn't right. Things that move fast create motion blur, but when footage with little or no blur is sped up, there is no blur created because blurring is actually an artifact created by a camera, or when working in a program like After Effects, blurring is a simulated artifact to make moving objects look like they were filmed by a camera. The simulation is created by calculating the motion of pixels along with the shutter angle and the shutter phases for your composition. I'll be covering this in more depth in a later tutorial. The point is that when you speed footage up, those artifacts are not created because all you're doing is speeding up the video and not actually creating motion, which means no blur can be simulated. So in this case, I have an explosion that was captured at 240 frames per second, creating a slow motion effect at 1/8 the speed of a real explosion. Later, for effects purposes, the footage was sped up by 800% so that it would play back at a seemingly normal speed. The problem is that there is no motion blur in the video because at such a high frame rate, little or no motion blur artifacts were created, and in speeding it up, there's no way to create that blur. Or is there? Well, as you've probably guessed, I didn't spend the last 1 minute and 33 seconds talking about a problem without a solution. And the solution, as you've probably guessed too, is to use the CC Force Motion Blur effect on your time-stretched footage. As you can see, it really does make a difference. The footage now has a blur where none existed before. Nice. I also want to mention that Psycore Systems, the team that brought you some of these great effects, have a product out called Psycore Effects HD. The package consists mostly of improved versions of the standard Psycore effects, with the majority of those improvements being found in the particle systems. There are too many to go into here, but as an example, the effects are now pixel aspect ratio aware, meaning that they work properly with non-square pixels. That's always been a problem that required pre-comping and other hotfixes. Also, the particle systems, such as CC Particle World, have seen major improvements, such as new physics for simulating more realistic effects, the ability to use an image or video as a particle texture, and volume shading for simulating depth. Again, these are only a few of the improvements. CC Particle Systems 2, for example, can now use a layer as the source of the particle emission. But what exactly makes these effects HD? Well, whereas the Psycore effects that come with After Effects are only 8-bit, these are 16-bit effects, meaning you have a larger range of colors available to work with. When your images are large, such as in the case of high-definition video, with a limited 8-bit color palette, you're more likely to see color banding in gradated areas. By working in a 16-bit color mode, you can minimize or even eliminate color banding because you have so many more colors to work with. And while all of the older effects have been ported over to the new HD versions, there are a few new effects as well, including CC Environment, a filter that enables the use of spherical panoramic images as environments in compositions, and which can utilize the After Effects 3D camera, something I've been waiting for a long time now. Overall, if you're working in high definition and you use the Psycore effects a lot, it's definitely worth checking out and downloading a trial version at www.psycoreeffects.com. And of course, don't forget you can get the files for this and other podcasts at www.creativecow.net/AE podcast. Once again, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net.